Hello and welcome to Inside the Admissions Office, the official podcast of InGenius Prep and your go-to resource for expert admission strategy. My name is Jillian, and I'm excited to be your guide through this wild ride of college admissions. Each episode, I'll bring you insights from former admissions officers who know the ins and outs of getting into your dream school and their first-hand experiences reviewing applications. Our strategies have helped countless students gain acceptance to top universities, and we're here to help your students gain that competitive edge and do the same. Whether you are just starting your college prep journey or knee-deep in applications, we've got you covered. So grab your notebooks, pencils, and maybe a cup of coffee. Let's dive in. Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for another exciting episode. Today we're talking about something that's on a lot of students and parents' minds, how teens are really holding up right now with so much pressure and constant change, from mental health challenges to the rise of AI, academic pressure, mental health stress, and nonstop digital life. There's a lot to unpack, and to help us make sense of it all, I'm joined by Kelly, one of our incredible counselors here at InGenius Prep. So Kelly, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Jillian. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here and just talk about how students are doing and how we can support them. Hopefully it'll be a good conversation.
I'm excited to have you on. But before we start, can you kick us off by introducing yourself, sharing a bit about your background and the kind of work you do with our students at InGenius Prep?
Hi, everyone. As Jillian mentioned, my name is Kelly. I'm currently based in Chicago, and I work as a former admissions officer for InGenius Prep with students who are aiming to obtain their undergraduate degrees. So I mostly work with students that are interested in the field of communication, entertainment. I've also had a handful of students that are interested in more STEM-related fields. But a common denominator that a lot of my students seem to have is they all come from some sort of arts background. And that is because I used to be a classical pianist myself. I obtained a Bachelor of Music degree from the Peabody Conservatory at Johns Hopkins University. That's also where I have my admissions experience from. And then after my admissions experience, I also obtained a master's degree in communications at Northwestern University. And through that, I started my consulting work at tech firms, at consulting firms, just with a lot of students in general. So that's where my love of just supporting students in their higher education journey began.
I think your background's pretty interesting. It's pretty much like arts and then also merging into the admission side. How was that transition like?
It was actually really smooth because how I started in the whole admissions field was I was a student on federal work study throughout college. I somehow got a job in the admissions office. So I worked there for 4 years. And throughout that time, I'm pursuing my piano performance degree. While I was in the federal work study period of my life, I was able to learn a lot of the ins and outs of the admissions processes and make a lot of connections and build my network within that field, not only from Hopkins, but from other schools as well, which was super exciting. And through admissions, I was able to almost marry the arts with more business and operations, which was a really cool experience.
I feel like your experience being a student, also transitioning to being a former admissions officer, it ties in really well with today's episode. Let's get started, shall we?
Yeah, for sure.
It seems like students are getting very overwhelmed than ever between school, social pressures, and also the constant digital activities like being on TikTok and Instagram and all that. What stands out to you most in your work with this generation of students? Like in your work with Gen Z students, especially at InGenius Prep, what kind of patterns or challenges stand out most to you right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I see a lot of myself in these students. It wasn't that long ago where I was going through the same process. However, I feel like it really does get more and more challenging with each passing year. Something I see with this generation of Gen Z students that keeps getting more and more firm every year is their almost irrefutable belief that status is of the highest value. What I mean by that is students and their parents believe that attending an Ivy League school will almost guarantee success in the students' careers and life goals, while those who are unable to gain admission to such top universities are going to struggle more than their Ivy League graduate counterparts. And I've definitely been there. My family has been through these worries ourselves. To avoid that almost like undesirable fate, I see students and their parents try to do a little bit of everything under the sun, hoping it will maximize their chances of being accepted to a place like Harvard, such as playing a different sport every year or really inconsistent involvement in 4 or 5 different community service organizations, because in their minds at this point in their journey, more equals safe. This is dangerous because this can lead to the jack of all trades, master of none label from an admissions perspective, which we want to avoid at all costs. That's a struggle I see with students who are trying to reach really high. But at the same time, I also see that students of this generation really do crave genuineness and authenticity, but they're either afraid to show it or are not completely sure how to really embody that. And I think with the challenges of the current state of the world, just outside of admissions, they can begin to feel so lost. So I hope that through my work with my students, we can help tackle these challenges together.
A lot of parents that send us like DMs on Instagram or even Facebook, they get really worried about their students' like extracurriculars or the sports that they're in. One of the parents reached out and she said that, oh, my daughter's in tennis, but she's not really good at it, but she still wants to continue just to showcase that there's some sort of consistency in her extracurricular activities. There's a struggle between having that consistency or having the child do something that they're more interested in and doing better in. Do you have any advice for parents that are struggling with that as well?
I think the most important thing is, no matter what your student does, no matter what kind of activities that they do, yes, skill and let's say level of expertise in that field is a huge plus for sure. But what admissions officers really do prioritize is how real is the student being? What is the intention behind their activities? Are they just doing this because they want to rack up community service hours? It's quite easy for admissions officers to tell whether or not a student is doing it for the right reasons, for lack of a better phrase. So I think as long as you can find a way to really codify all of your activities with your intended major, I think it should be smoother sailing. So I would definitely avoid pushing your child to do everything all at once just because you think it'll look good on the resume, because it could actually end up being very harmful to the student's candidacy.
I like the thing that you said about intention. I think parents and students struggle to find a balance with. Talking about mental health, it has been a huge concern for many years now. And it feels like we're hitting like a tipping point. Rates of anxiety, depression, general burnout are climbing while students are still expected to perform at high levels. And yet skills like time management, planning, and even emotional regulation, what we call executive functioning and soft skills, are more essential than ever for helping these students manage all this stress. So from your perspective, how do executive functioning skills connect to students' emotional well-being? Where do you see students struggling the most, and how can we support them in building these skills?
I think I see students struggling the most when it comes to them actually believing in the value of executive functioning skills. They're so focused on trying to get the highest GPA that they tend to neglect important skills like the ones you mentioned, time management, risk mitigation, stuff like that. And I'm not saying that GPA maintenance is not important. It definitely is. But mastering these executive functioning skills will set up students for success in things beyond the college admissions experience and the classroom. Like time management and planning ahead, for example, can reduce feelings of anxiety and really help with mental overload. This allows students to feel that they're more in control. And once they feel more in control, their workload can begin to feel a lot more manageable. And it can also get them even excited to tackle such tasks and help them feel on top of their game. It will also help them avoid procrastination, which is, in my opinion, one of the worst things a student can do to themselves, especially when it comes to actually filling out the application, writing your essays for college. So mastering all of these EF skills are important for leading a healthier life and minimizing the number of times that you burn out, or even the impact of toxic burnout cycles. So it's not just about productivity, but it's a core part of students' emotional health, because if they're emotionally healthy, then they're mentally healthy. And if they're mentally healthy, they can also be healthy academically.
There's this growing narrative, especially among high achieving students, that if you're not doing something extraordinary, you're already behind. And there's a recent study found or have done by Pew Research Center, and I'll link it in the description if anybody listening now would be interested to read up about this. So this research showcases 68% of students feel significant pressure just to get good grades. And I think that's a lot to carry. So how do you see this pressure shaping students, not just in how they approach school, but in how they see themselves as people? Are there ways that educators like yourself or parents can help reframe what success looks like?
I mentioned earlier that our students felt the need to always be like quote unquote on. They have to keep working, keep putting in the hours, stuff like that, right? And I think a lot of times this stems from the fear that if they don't study an immense amount, then they won't get good grades. And then if they don't get good grades, they'll be a failure. This belief then prompts students to shift their identities toward external validation. When results, let's say a 4.0 GPA or a 5 on an AP exam, if these become your primary measure of worth, then students begin to tie their self-esteem to performance rather than character. This can also stunt their growth as students because failure, or the fear of failure really, may steer them away from making risky moves such as challenging themselves to a new activity or just going against the status quo. Since society as a whole praises these high-performing students, success also becomes all about pleasing others and gaining their stamp of approval. And it becomes less about what am I actually interested in? What am I actually passionate or curious about? It just encourages perfectionism and fear-based motivation instead of, again, that curiosity and work ethic. I think this can also be so harmful to their social relationships. Because of the stress, they might withdraw from their loved ones and they feel the need to like isolate themselves because they have to keep overworking themselves. Or maybe they start even feeling competitive and they don't want their competition to know what they're working on. So the constant need to prove themselves as hardworking can eventually lead to students prioritizing things like achievement over values, personal growth, or honestly just like knowing a life outside of prestige. I really do believe college is the place to really get started on finding out your why. Why am I pursuing this? Why am I trying to create relationships with this specific person? College is usually the first time in a student's life where they're surrounded by people because they chose to be there, not because their parents took them to church or signed them up for ESL class or something. So they chose to be there. They're choosing who to be friends with. They have a lot more autonomy. And I think a lot of times that they forget that they have that autonomy because they're so focused on pleasing other people, like their professors or making their parents proud, that they begin to grow very resentful of, oh my gosh, I have to be here and get the highest grade. Otherwise, I'm wasting everyone's time and my time. And it just sucks the joy out of making the most out of their college years.
Have you read any essays from students in their applications and felt like I wanted more out of the student in terms of expressing their personality or character instead of just their achievements?
Yes, I have one personal statement that I read that really stuck with me because this personal statement really did show me their character. Something I always tell my students is don't tell me the story, show me the story. When you watch a movie, you never want the message thrown at your face. You want to be able to gather context clues throughout scenes of the movie and try to theorize in your own mind, okay, where's this movie taking me? Like, I see elements of this, hints of that, but what is it really coming to? If it's revealed in the beginning, like who the villain is, you're like, okay, what am I doing here? What did I just watch? And it becomes a really boring watch. But instead, if a movie hints at things here and there and takes you on a complete plot twist, then you're like, oh my gosh, that was an amazing movie. So same thing with these personal statements. I want you to show me your story instead of telling me your story. And so going back to that one personal statement that I read that really stuck with me, there was a student who was applying to Hawkins and they were talking about smelly school lunches. And I was like, okay, where is this going? Because there's a lot you can do with a smelly school lunch, right? And I have stories of smelly school lunches myself. But they used this smelly school lunch story to not just say, I had a tough childhood. My parents struggled financially. That was a tiny bit of a story, but it really just set up the scene. The actual story was a story of redemption for the student who was writing this personal statement. They were sharing the redemption that they had with their relationships, the broken relationship that they had with their parents, of feeling those resentment, that embarrassment, even shame over having a lunch that was smelly compared to their counterparts at grade school who seemed to bring normal lunches. And this smelly lunch thing, it really ended up just instilling a fear in the student of people's intentions, people's beliefs of the student, and they became a people pleaser. I thought that this personal statement was so interesting and heartfelt because I could see that the student recognized, hey, this happened, but this is what I did to change it, and this is who I am today because of my growth through this smelly lunch story. So that was an amazing thing that always stuck with me throughout my admissions time.
I feel like the student is not afraid to be vulnerable. A lot of students actually also send me DMs asking if I can share our past students' example of personal statements because they want to know how to write a perfect essay, a perfect personal statement. But it's really about their experiences, right? Like everybody has their own journey and experiences in life. So students are just struggling sometimes of how to really showcase that.
I personally am not really a fan of sharing past examples because, like you said, then these new prospective students will try to create a carbon copy of that. And then this has already been done before. And these top colleges really are looking for unique individuals. They misunderstand the word unique for, I don't know, like something crazy. They think that they have to have a crazy traumatic experience and they really try to milk it out for this personal statement. Otherwise, they think that they have nothing to offer. But that's simply not true. You just have to be able to speak in your own voice about who you are and why you are the way you are and what you want to bring to the school that you'd like to attend. I would say don't be afraid of the discomfort that you feel. Honestly, just sit in your discomfort and really think through why you are the way you are, what makes you you. As long as you're willing to sit through that initial discomfort or maybe even insecurity, you are already on the path to a more genuine and amazing personal statement.
I've had this conversation with other counselors as well. They don't like the word unique because then students overthink about it. They're just sitting down like, oh, my life is just so boring. Nothing dramatic is happening. So like they get really confused on how to even start. But yeah, I like that you said that you just have to really think about your own life. Everybody's life is so different and you just got to dig in there and share your own personal story.
Yeah, exactly.
Gen Z is growing up in a totally different world. Like it's completely digital, even compared to 5 years ago. The social media, 24/7 connection, and the constant input shape how they communicate, learn, and even build their sense of identity. So what do you think this nonstop digital environment is doing to students' emotional development and attention spans? Are there upsides to this hyper-connected life that we don't talk about enough?
I have so much to say on this one. First of all, it's like a very timely question because with COVID happening back in 2020, we just saw the boom of platforms like TikTok where people were really just seeking that quick connection with people. Even when I was growing up and preparing for the college admissions process, there were already concerns over students' attention spans and things they were being exposed to online at a young age. And now that I've gone through my own experience with college admissions, and now I am mentoring the young Gen Zs, the challenges that these young people face are deserving of our attention. So having access to a platform like TikTok where anyone can share anything can leave Gen Z students feeling like they're behind others or even make them question if they'll ever achieve anything remotely similar. And now when it comes to attention span, that's a completely different story. TikTok is fast and easy to use and really simple to absorb, no matter how long, if it's like short form or long form content, right? No matter the time or the length of the content, things are constantly moving because you can scroll so easily. And you'll know content is even better the longer users stay on one video and the more they engage with it with like likes or comments, stuff like that. So TikTok is designed to maximize engagement, not necessarily focus. And so we see students struggle in the classroom with having to sit in their seats for an hour and focus on one topic even more so these days comparatively to 10, 20 years ago. Honestly, even 5 years ago, like before we had TikTok and COVID, because their attention spans are becoming so limited and they're really struggling with focusing. It's not that they don't want to focus, but they just can't seem to, or they have a very hard time doing so. It impacts deep thinking skills. But an upside I can think of is empowerment through TikTok.
Yeah.
Yes, seeing the way other people look and live can be harmful, but it really depends on how you choose to absorb the material. So in that way, platforms like TikTok can also be really powerful, because when people share their lives on social media, whether it highlights wins or losses, they attract a community who is experiencing similar things. The algorithm will bring things to your For You page that is tailored to you because they attract like-minded people. So it can also help people feel connected, supported, and encouraged to keep improving and keep learning, no matter what it is. In that way, it can definitely be super helpful and empowering.
Layering AI into the mix, tools like ChatGPT and AI tutors are becoming part of the learning process, whether it's homework, brainstorming, or even writing essays. I think on one hand, AI can make education more personalized and accessible, but on the other, it raises real questions about academic integrity and students becoming overly reliant on tech to think for them. First part of the question will be, from your perspective, working with students every day, what kind of trends are you seeing? Is AI helping students dive deeper and engaging more effectively? And second part of the question, do you see AI as an equalizer in education, or is it adding new pressure to keep up?
This is definitely a question that a lot of educators seem to be dealing with recently. This answer really does change for every person. Again, we are touching back on that intentionality aspect behind education. If a student possesses a genuine desire to learn, then tools like ChatGPT are amazing and can be incredibly helpful. It can propose ideas to think more deeply about something, or even challenge something like what they currently believe. But like I said, that's all ChatGPT is meant to be: a tool, a helper. It's not a source of truth. The source of truth about what you believe should come from you, the student, not from this bot, right?
Yeah.
So if a student doesn't have the desire to learn, then ChatGPT can easily become a playground for students that hope to get away with awful things like plagiarism or just any form of unoriginal ideation. But for students who are interested in what they're learning about and truly curious, then ChatGPT encourages that innovative thinking. It helps streamline processes, helps make processes more efficient, stuff like that. I feel like depending on the student, it can either help level the playing field, or it can add in a new layer of pressure, because maybe people just want to catch up and actually learn. Or maybe they only want what seems to be perfectly correct answers and just send them off and pass them off as their own. So you got to be careful with the way you utilize such tools. I wouldn't necessarily recommend against using a tool like this. Just use it with discretion and make sure that there's discernment in using stuff like this.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. Like, ChatGPT is actually an amazing tool, but it's just something that could be a good aid to you. You don't have to 100% think of it as, okay, whatever information is coming from here is the truth. And I think students just sometimes maybe they have procrastinated and they're like, it's okay, I'll just take this as my work and then I'll just submit it as is.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, like from an educator's perspective, if you've been with a student for 3 months and you've read some of their writing pre-ChatGPT, you become very familiar with the student's writing style. And even if you haven't read so much of their writing yet, students tend to speak in a way or write in a way that they speak, right?
Yeah.
So honestly, a lot of times to educators, it becomes very obvious whether or not the student is word for word just copying what ChatGPT told them to write, because like I said, their voice is lost. Same thing from the admissions perspective when it comes to reading the supplemental essays or their personal statement. Even if we don't really know the student before receiving their application, most of the time it's pretty obvious if it's a human voice writing this or if it's a robot being very stoic and matter of fact. So we are aware.
Have you ever turned down an application from a student when you realize that, oh, I feel like this was done by an AI tool? It wasn't written by the student themselves.
In my work with InGenius, and I'm reading through all of my students' essays, there are definitely times where I can see, okay, this is not you. this is actually ChatGPT. Because again, I've gotten to know them for half a year at least at this point. I know what they care about. I know their style of speaking and writing. And all of a sudden, if something comes up that's like very much not this student, I'm like, hey, let's revisit this. Tell me what's going on. And I never want to shame them for it, but I do have to keep them honest, because if they're trying to submit a summer program application with this not genuine at all essay, it's going to become very clear. So again, going back to my point from the very beginning of learn to sit with initial discomfort. If you sit through that, then ideas will come. Students a lot of times use tools like ChatGPT because, again, they want that instant gratification and they think ChatGPT knows what it's talking about. But a lot of times they lose their voice in doing that. It becomes really obvious. So I always have to send those essays back and be like, hey, let's write it from your brain, your heart.
If you had a magic wand and could change just one thing about how we support middle and high school students today, what would it be? What would a truly balanced, student-centered support system look like, whether it's at school or at home?
I'm like thinking of myself now, like me as a 17-year-old trying to go through this whole process. For background, I went through just a really rigorous process of getting ready for school applications. Like I was practicing my piano for 6+ hours a day on school days, and then 8+ hours on the weekends, and then also maintaining my GPA and trying to get my community service hours and like everything. And I also had the mindset of I have to prove that everything that my parents invested in me will be worth it, because I have to get into a school like Hopkins. Otherwise, my parents' efforts will be wasted. And I especially had this mindset because I'm a first-generation American. My parents came here from South Korea in the 90s. And they don't have a 4-year degree. So I am also a first-generation college student. And I'm also a firstborn child. So really, like, they were putting all their hopes and dreams on me for very good reason. But I took that as, oh my gosh, I have to be the best or I will be failing everybody, right? And I never communicated to my parents how it was making me feel. So it caused a lot of misunderstanding and just like struggle between us during that time. So it was a really hard time emotionally. I could really encourage parents and siblings of those who are going through the admissions procedure to have a lot of empathy. That would be amazing, because schools and parents expect so much from their students. And a lot of it because they believe in their students. But if not communicated clearly, it can really just add on to the burden of having to feel like they have to constantly outperform themselves, their peers, which again leads to burnout, our favorite word, right?
Yeah.
So I'd encourage parents and teachers to practice compassionate teaching. Take the time to really learn to understand your students' behavior, and please avoid shaming, especially in public, for underperforming. I say this because I know from my own experience having Korean parents, I can't speak to all about the Korean parents out there, but for my Korean parents, they really liked to compare me to my counterparts. And for them, it was meant as a way to motivate me to do better. But honestly, me being an insecure 17-year-old, all I took away from it was guilt and shame and feeling like I wasn't good enough. Make sure to really check in on your student, provide regular mental health support. If you don't know what mental health support means, there are resources online. Google is so easy to use, parents, so please use it. Let them know that you are there for them, you are rooting for them, and that you are inspired by their desire to do well. So recognize their efforts over outcome, and do not attempt to change the core of who your students are just to get into an Ivy or an Ivy plus school. Instead of molding your student to fit the school, you can think about it in the sense that, does this school fit my student? Does this school have what it takes to help my student grow and maximize their potential? I think with that flip in mindset, parents and teachers can already become so much more empathetic and supportive. And once the student feels that coming from their family and their mentors, they also have this desire to do well.
The communication part, parents need to be very strategic in how you communicate with your child or student, making sure that they are heard and you understand what they're interested in and maybe what they're not good at. If they're willing to work on it, if they're not, don't force them to do something that they don't want to do. Maybe have an active conversation with them, make them feel included and heard.
Yeah, exactly. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with executive functioning. I really feel like communication skills is an underrated skill that families families seem to look over because, again, they're focusing on the metrics of their students' performance. But keep an open line of communication, and hopefully that will really launch your student into not just endurance for this tough cycle, but it will really get them to where they want to be eventually.
Yeah, definitely. If you could offer that one mindset shift or a small daily habit to help them feel more grounded, what would it be?
I'm going to expand a little bit on something I said before, which is the world is full of noise. Students already have to deal with their own thoughts. And if they live with others, there's even more opinions floating around, like your parents or siblings or relatives, roommates. Then they'll go to school or their extracurricular activities where they'll have even more people telling them what they should be doing, who they should aim to be. And then if they open TikTok, and their feed will again be people asking viewers to listen to what they have to say. I'm not saying that any of this is bad necessarily. However, when do students, or honestly any of us really, ever have moments of complete peace and silence? I feel like that's never, right? Especially in such a digital world. In a society like America, where hustle culture is so deeply valued, when do you have a moment where you can just breathe and actually feel the air on your skin, listen to the sounds of nature? When do we have moments when it's just us and our thoughts and nobody else's? My advice here would be, do not be afraid of silence. And this connects to my point earlier of do not be afraid to sit with your initial discomfort. And a lot of that comes from silence. I feel like a lot of students have heard this piece of advice before, but they don't actually take it seriously. But I'm telling you guys, like, it is a life changer. If you budget in 5 minutes of silence somewhere in your day, and you wake up the next morning and the first thing you do isn't opening a social media app, it can be so helpful for you to just re-ground yourself. You can even just walk into a different room of the house and sink into the couch and feel your muscles relax. Every decision you make will simply be a redirective push towards the path that you're meant to walk. So if you take the time to focus on your strengths, your goals, and your passions, what you make of your life, focusing on these three things, will produce a successful life. And successful meaning what you are meant to be doing, not what other people tell you to do. Don't compare yourself to what other people are doing. So something I really like to say to my students is eat the meat, leave the bones. And what that means is take whatever is helpful and valuable to you and your path, and leave behind everything else that does not serve you, such as comparison, guilt, or shame.
I think that's like the perfect way to end this podcast, to be honest. Such great advice, Kelly. I'm so glad to have you on, to be honest, because we've never had this kind of episode talking about like mental health and executive functioning and the balance of using AI tools. I'm just so glad to have you on, to be honest. I hope you had fun.
I totally did. Thank you so much for having me on. Everything that we talked about is just so timely to our current environment, and competition really does get more and more fierce every single year. So it's a great way for us to just revisit conversations about what actually matters. I think this can be applicable to literally everybody listening. So thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you would like to speak to one of our experts, you can set up a complimentary strategy call with one of our enrollment counselors by following the link in our episode description. And for more information and access to additional resources, you can register for our webinars, which is also linked in the episode description. If you have any questions or would like to request a topic for a future episode, you can email me directly at jillian.yong, that's JILIAN.YONG@ingeniusprep.com. Thank you for listening to another episode of Inside the Admissions Office, and don't forget to follow the podcast so you're notified every time a new episode is available. That is all for now, and I hope this was helpful for everybody tuning in, and we will see you in the next episode.